Section 22 of From the Latchkey of My Bookhouse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Latchkey of My Bookhouse, edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. Section 22. Shelley, Percy Bysshe, English, born 1792, died 1822. Percy Bysshe Shelley was the son of a stubborn old English baronet, Sir Timothy Shelley, who was tyrannical and harsh in his own home and yet observed ceremoniously all the outward forms of religion. The boy had a beautiful gifted mother, but his father's character made him early learn to hate oppression and a religion that was all show and no spirit. At school he was a shy boy, persecuted and made fun of by his fellows, and this still further strengthened his hatred of oppression. At 17 he was expelled from Oxford for writing a pamphlet concerning religion. His father then angrily forbade him the house, and he made the sad mistake of marrying a young girl of 16, Harriet Westbrook, a school friend of his sister's, who appealed to his sense of chivalry and made him believe that she was ill-used at home. Young Shelley had a perfect passion for justice and freedom, downright sincerity and truth, and he longed to establish an ideal state of love and brotherhood. At 19, the fiery youth set off to redress the wrongs of Ireland. A little later, he wrote several revolutionary pamphlets in England, which he sent to sea in bottles and boxes for winds and waves to circulate. These made it necessary for him to flee for a time into Wales. When he was 21, he separated from his young wife and went to France and Italy, where he spent the rest of his life with Mary Godwin Shelley, his second wife. He was a great friend of Byron and Keats and one of England's foremost poets. At 30, he was drowned while sailing on the Mediterranean. Shepherd, Odell, American poet and literary critic, born 1884. Southey, Robert, English, born 1774, died 1843, poet of the Lake District, friend of Wordsworth and Coleridge. Spencer, Edmund, English, born 1552, died 1599, one of the supremely great poets of Queen Elizabeth's period. Spiri, Johanna, Swiss writer of children's stories, born 1829. Important works: Corneli, Heidi, Moni the Goat Boy, Rico and Wizelli. Stedman, Edmund Clarence, American critic, born 1833, died 1908. Stevenson, Robert Louis, Scotch, born 1850, died 1894. Robert Louis Stevenson was born in Edinburgh. He was the son of a noted engineer who had the interesting task of planning and building great lighthouses that flashed out their signal lights all along the Scottish coast. The boy's father intended him likewise for an engineer, but Robert was scarcely strong enough for such a life, so he studied to be a lawyer. When he was a young man, he once went off with his canoe to paddle through the canals and rivers, the quaint, trim villages and pleasant fields of Belgium and France. He followed this with a walking trip through the rich beauties of southern France, having as his only companion a particularly stubborn donkey. When he returned to England, he wrote so delightfully of these journeys, An Inland Voyage and Travels with a Donkey, that his friends began to urge him to give up other work and do nothing but write. A year or so later, Stevenson heard that the young lady whom he was to marry, a Mrs. Osborne, was ill in California, so he set out to join her. Travel was expensive, and he had little money, so what did he do but go as a steerage passenger on the boat among all the hodgepodge of immigrants, queer characters jabbering the strange tongues of half the countries of Europe. Then he crossed the American continent on an immigrant train. In San Francisco he married Mrs. Osborne, and after some months in a desolate mining camp, he returned with her and his little stepson to Scotland. Stevenson had never been strong or well, though he was the cheeriest man imaginable and never let ill health keep him from work. In the years following his marriage, he wandered about with his family in all sorts of curious places, seeking a spot where he could live more comfortably. At last he settled down on one of the Samoan Islands, a tropical paradise amid the soft blue waters of the South Seas. Here he had a beautiful place called Vailima at the foot of a lofty mountain. How truly he enjoyed making acquaintance with the simple, hospitable, brown-skinned natives. He acquired great influence in their affairs and used to sit in state at their councils. In spite of his physical weakness, Stevenson was ever at work, writing, and his heart was so full of keen boyish love of adventure that he left boys and girls such stories as no man has ever surpassed. In 1894 he died at Vailima as courageously and cheerily as he had lived, and his body was borne by 60 natives up Mount Vaia to rest in a beautiful spot above his home. Important works: Treasure Island, Kidnapped, The Master of Ballantrae, Child's Garden of Verse. Stockton, Francis R. American novelist, born 1834, died 1902. Important works: The Bee-Man of Orne, Fanciful Tales, The Adventures of Captain Horn. Stowe, Harriet Beecher, American, born 1811, died 1896. Mrs. Stowe is best known as the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Swinburne, Algernon C., English poet, born 1837, died 1909. Tagore, Rabindranath, East Indian, born 1861. Tagore was born in Calcutta. Very early he lost his mother, and his regret colours all his poems of mother and child love. He was a lonely little fellow, for his father was often away from home. Nature, the clouds in the sky, the flowers, the leaves were his beloved companions. A harsh master made his school days very unhappy, so he ran away. Then his father gave him private tutors and took him to the Himalayas, where he studied and began to write songs and stories. At 23 he married and was sent to manage his father's estates on the Ganges. He went unwillingly at first, but soon he realized with deep satisfaction the joy of coming so closely in touch with his people. Here he wrote many of his best plays. When he was 40 he lost his wife, his daughter, and his young son. In his sorrow and restlessness he started a boys' school which he aimed to make a model place where boys could be educated with all the freedom and self-government possible. Tagore is one of the greatest East Indian thinkers. Taylor, Bayard, American writer and traveller, born 1825, died 1878. Taylor, Jane, English children's poet, born 1783, died 1824. Tennyson, Alfred Lord, English, born 1809, died 1892. Alfred Tennyson's father was the rector of Somersby, and the boy lived in a quiet, pleasant home where there was plenty of time for reading and reflection. He was always the storyteller for his brothers and sisters, and his favourite game was to write endless romances, which he slipped under the dishes at table to be read when the business of eating was over. When he was only 18, he and his brother Charles published a volume of verse called Poems by Two Brothers. From then on, Alfred slowly rose, struggling often against poverty, to be poet laureate and the best-loved poet in England. Further reading: Idylls of the King, The Princess, Tennyson for the Young by Ainger. Thackeray, William Makepeace, English, born 1811, died 1863. Thackeray was born in Calcutta. His father died when he was a tiny boy, and his mother married again. His stepfather was a kindly gentleman, very like the dear old Colonel Newcome in one of Thackeray's stories. While his mother and stepfather stayed in India, William was sent to England to be educated. He was not happy at school, for the boys were rough while he was gentle, and he was not overly clever at lessons or games. As a young man, Thackeray studied drawing in Paris, but he could not support himself by drawing, so he began to write. The Book of Snobs, published in Punch, brought him great success. Unfortunately, Thackeray's young wife had become insane, and his two little daughters were henceforth his constant companions. In his novels, which are accurate pictures of the life of his time, he holds up to sharp ridicule the snobbery he detested. He has written one book for children, the deliciously funny Rose and the Ring. Thaxter, Celia, American, born 1836, died 1894. Born in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, lived at the Isles of Shoals. Thompson-Seton, Ernest. English, born 1860. A well-known writer of true animal stories, he was born in England but lived in Canada and on the Western Plains in boyhood. Important works: Wild Animals I Have Known, Biography of a Grizzly, Lives of the Hunted. Thorne Thompson, Gudrun, contemporary. One of the most satisfactory editors of Norse tales for children. Important works: East of the Sun and West of the Moon, The Birch and the Star. Tolstoy, Leof N. Russian, born 1828, died 1910. At Yasnaya Polyana, which means bright glade, lived young Leof Tolstoy, a sensitive, plain-appearing little fellow of strong affections, who loved games and horses and dogs and country life. Bright Glade was a pretty place, a large wooden house surrounded by woods and avenues of lime trees, with a river and 4 lakes on the estate. Leof's father and mother died when he was small, and he was brought up by his aunt Tatiana, whom he loved very dearly. She used to welcome all sorts of queer pilgrims to Bright Glade, beggars and monks and poor despised wanderers, so the boy's life was always simple and unworldly. One day Leof's brother Nicholas invented a game called Ant Brothers. He bade Leof and the other 2 brothers crawl under 2 armchairs, hide themselves from view with handkerchiefs and boxes, and cling lovingly together in the dark. Then he told them that he possessed a secret which, when it was known, would make all men happy. There would be no more disease, no trouble, and no one would be angry with anyone else. All would love one another and become ant brothers. This secret, he said, he had written on a green stick and buried by the road at the edge of a certain ravine. The boys played the game often, but the great secret was never revealed to them. Nevertheless, that secret, the way for men to cease from suffering, to leave off quarrelling and be always happy, was what Leof sought all his life. At Bright Glade, Tolstoy lived with a wife and 13 jolly children, writing books and joining in all the family sports. But more and more he came to hate the idle, frivolous, useless life of the rich, the injustice of governments and society, which gave so much to the rich and so little to the poor, the jealousies and selfishness that made war among men, and finally he gave up everything else that he might devote himself to, making happier lives for the poor serfs who laboured on his estates. He tried to get back to the pure Christianity that Jesus taught, to lead a life of simplicity and work, of love and brotherhood, and so he lived among his peasants, sharing the hardest manual labour and dressing just as they did, a smock in summer, a sheepskin coat and cap in winter. The tyrannical Russian government of those days frowned darkly on his views, but more and more men looked to him as a great leader, thinker and teacher. When he was over 70, Tolstoy wrote, "The ideal of ant brothers, lovingly clinging to one another, though not under 2 armchairs curtained by handkerchiefs, but of all mankind under the wide dome of heaven, has remained the same for me, as I then believed that there existed a little green stick whereon was written the message that could destroy all evil and men and give them universal welfare. So I now believe that such truth exists and will be revealed to men and will give them all its promises." Important works: Gospel stories, 23 tales, In Pursuit of Happiness. Topelius Zacharias, Finnish poet and novelist, born 1818, died 1898. Trowbridge, John Townsend, American novelist, born 1827, died 1916. Van Dyke, Henry, American clergyman and writer, born 1852. Important works: The First Christmas Tree, The Blue Flower, The Story of the Other Wise Man. Warner, Charles Dudley, American editor, born 1829, died 1900. Watts, Isaac, English hymn writer and preacher, born 1674, died 1748. White, Stewart Edward, American novelist, born 1873. Important works: Adventures of Bobby Ord, The Magic Forest, Gold, California in 1849. Whittier, John Greenleaf, American poet, born 1807, died 1892. Whittier was born in Haverhill, Massachusetts, of a hard-working Quaker family. As a small boy, he wrote poetry, which he hid from everyone but his older sister. One day the postman tossed him a newspaper, and what should he see but one of his own verses in print? His sister had sent it in, and from now on he contributed regularly to the paper. Soon the editor, William Lloyd Garrison, grew interested in him, sought him out, and urged him to educate himself. So the boy earned his tuition at Haverhill Academy by making slippers at 8 cents apiece. He grew up to be the great poet of the anti-slavery movement. His office was burned and he was mobbed for his views, but he continued to write poems full of rugged strength and deep religious feeling. Wilde, Oscar, English dramatist and novelist, born 1856, died 1900. Important works: The Happy Prince and Other Stories. Wilson, Woodrow, American, born 1856. Woodrow Wilson was born in Virginia, brought up and educated in Georgia and South Carolina. As president of Princeton University, as governor of New Jersey, and as president of the United States, 1912 to 1920, he instituted great reforms, always along the lines of more truly democratic ideals. During the World War, it was he who first made plain to the world that what the Allies were really fighting to protect and uphold was the principle of democratic government. It was also he who sought to work toward a lasting foundation for peace by urging persistently on the world the League of Nations. Wordsworth, William, English poet, born 1770, died 1850. Young William Wordsworth loved to ramble high up into the hills near his home, besides the lakes and sounding cataracts, until all nature came to life, and flowers and mists and winds found voice and spoke to him. They told him he was one with all that overflowing soul that lives throughout the universe, and in his joy it seemed to him that he saw blessings spread around him like a sea. So the boy grew up pure in heart and content with modest pleasures. All his life long he loved to tramp, and often his sister Dorothy was his comrade. With all his worldly goods done up in a handkerchief, he tramped through France in the early days of the French Revolution. He walked through England, Scotland, Wales, and many parts of Europe. At last he settled down with Dorothy at Grasmere in the beautiful Lake Country, to seek in solitude a deeper understanding of the universe and to express in poetry all the songs that nature sang to his innermost heart. At last he settled down with Dorothy at Grasmere in the beautiful Lake Country, to seek in solitude a deeper understanding of the universe and to express in poetry all the songs that nature sang to his inmost heart. Here, likewise, he married, and found a warm friend in the poet Coleridge, who lived nearby. But while Coleridge aimed to make the weird and supernatural seem real in his poetry, Wordsworth aimed with deep simplicity to write of the commonplace and to find in the humblest lives nobility and strength. Yonge, Charlotte, English novelist, born 1823, died 1901. Zangwill, Israel, a great Jewish writer of England, born 1864. End of section 22.